Thank you for joining us again and welcome back to our channel. If you are joining us for the first time, I appreciate your time. In this episode, I will be diving deep into the reason why Russia has returned to the continent of Africa. I will explore this from a strategic point and a geopolitical perspective. I will also analyze to you why it's so important and the reason why African countries should be paying closer attention with what is happening in their environment. So without any more delay, let's just dive straight into it. Russia is making a big push for a closer relations with the continent of Africa. It aims to gain access to energy resources and in return offers military support and arms sales. Its goals are not only economic. It wants to show the world that it is still a global power, as well as challenge the United States of America, Europe and China as make their own case and inroads into the continent of Africa. I will look into the reason why Russia has showed renewed interest in the continent of African relationship ties. I would access the aspect with regards to resources and rapid military support in the region and sales. Africa was a prominent theater for Soviet initiatives during the Cold War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, it appeared that Russia's interest in Africa all but died. For years, the new state lacked the capacity to sustain any kind of substantial engagement with African states, though occasionally Russian President Vladimir Putin or one of his foreign ministers will make a tour of the continent to reset Russian interest. These days are over. Russia is returning to Africa and using all of its instruments of power, including diplomacy, energy, investment, and also scholarships to Russian universities for African students. It often conceals its presence through so-called private institutions that are really controlled by the state. One such entity, a private military company, the PMC, called the Wagner Group, has been deployed to the Central African Republic to support that country's government against local insurgency. In Rwanda, President Paul Kagame recently asked President Putin for more energy deals, arms sales and slots for college students in Russian schools. Based on our research, other states like Sudan have also explicitly combined appeals for what Russians call military technical cooperation, that is, arms sales and support for Russian air and also naval bases in their country. South Africa has very close relations with Russia through common membership in the BRICS countries. Russian diplomats now eagerly traveled around Africa to advance their brand.
And there is an element of anti-Western feeling, a sense that Russia is not a colonial power.
Technically, Russia did not colonize any African states. And even during the time, the Cold War and the post-independence movement, Russia was credited with being able to still give some sort of diplomatic, economic, as well as security support to emerging governments. There were lots of exchanges at the time. There were educational exchanges. A number of leaders, if you look at the Mozambican leaders or even in Southern Africa, key leaders did study in Moscow and came back and have been embedded in government institutions for a long time. So there was a way that it played a positive role at that time in strengthening some of the elements that enabled governance in African countries, and at the same time presenting a different force compared with the West.
Do you feel that the Russian position is making progress in Africa as a whole, or have the pictures that we've all seen from Ukraine rather given Russia a pushback?
It feels as though Putin is both trying to show himself, not just against the West, but also to show that there is some influence within the African continent. It's a continuation of these historic links, this sort of sentimentalism that comes from post-independence or the Cold War movement, ensuring there's some sort of economic benefit, even though it's seen to be exploitative, and also sort of entrenching a foothold, whether it's in the defense sector, and showing that it is or it can be a reliable partner.
Moving forward, looking at energy, mining and other very important sectors, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has already made 2 major tours of Africa, looking at his travel to the region, but Russia's offensive on the continent precedes those visits. Already in 2015, the RT Global Resources, and subsidiary of the Rustic State Corp, Russian huge corporation for arms sales and also other infrastructural projects, headed by Vladimir Putin, Sergey Lavrov, won a $30 million contract for a new oil refinery in Uganda. Rostec is spearheading a drive to increase Russia's access to African governments as well as its energy minerals, therefore fostering trade and boosting domestic employment. African markets have become much more important to Russia since the implementation of the Western sanctions in 2014. Looking at Russia's presence, Russia often uses promises of arms sales to gain entry into African countries' energy and mining sector as well. In countries like Mozambique, with huge natural gas reserve, Russia has shown intense interest in investing in large-scale gold mining operations in Sudan. Russians often use debt forgiveness, development assistance, and promises of arms sales, like we've pointed out, to encourage African leaders to grant its companies entry into their energy and mining sector. Defense-related technologies like satellites also figure out in Russian business deals with African countries like Angola. Such agreements also bring other opportunities for sales in telecommunications sector. Russian diplomats have stated that the country also wants to stimulate bilateral trade and investment in the transport sector and agricultural sector as well as in nuclear energy.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has arrived in Guinea as he starts a 3-country tour of West Africa. He's visited the continent several times in the past 2 years as Moscow looks to increase its influence there. Nicholas Hack has been more from Senegal.
So we're on our way to meet a Russia-Africa expert, and I've ordered a Yango, which is a Russian company here in Senegal that operates taxis. It's one of the many Russian companies that have started investing in West Africa. Russia has been winning hearts and minds, especially here in West Africa, thanks to videos that it publishes on social media, like this one that's on Telegram, where we see Russian fighters from the mercenary group, the Wagner group, handing out aid, and you can clearly see the Russian flag, and it shows Russia stepping in and succeeding where the West has failed. So our taxi driver is from neighboring Guinea, and that's where the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergey Lavrov, is. He's there to try to talk about security, but also access to the untapped reserves of bauxite. And much of his trip is about not just security, but also access to minerals that Russia needs. When it comes to trade, Russia is lagging far behind the West, with only $14 billion traded last year. Compare that with the European Union that traded $300 billion worth of goods and services with Africa last year.
Russians are seen as an economic, security and strategic alternative to the West for the development of African states. And anything that bothers or diminishes the West seems popular with young Africans at the moment.
Vladimir Putin has rarely stepped foot on the African continent, but his chief diplomatic envoy has certainly multiplied his tours of the region, and this latest one comes at a time when Russia is increasingly isolated in the West, but certainly not here on the African continent.
If you look at Russia's strategic move in the region, considering military ties, Russian military intelligence, the GRU, is clearly increasing its presence in Africa. In 2014, Russia and South Africa jointly launched a satellite that provides surveillance for the entire continent. South African and Russian military intelligence were reported to be the key role players in the project. In Egypt and Libya, the Russian military presence is so substantial that Moscow is seeking air and naval bases like those it had some 40 to 50 years ago. In Libya, Russia provides the rebel Libyan government in Tobruk under the General Khalifa Haifa with military advice and diplomatic support at the United Nations. As of 2016, Russia printed nearly 4 billion dinars, that is over $2.8 billion for Libya's central bank, and then transferred the money to the branches loyal to the Tobruk government. General Haftar has frequently visited Moscow and held conferences with Defense Minister Sergey Lavrov. All this has also led to the talk about the potential Russian base in Libya, something that Stalin also sought in the 1945. Based on our research, if you consider this, Russia has been eager to strengthen ties with Rwanda, a real military power in Central Africa, and to prevent it and France from hurting Russian interests in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 2014, Moscow signed an agreement to provide Kinshasa with military equipment and weapons. Looking at other reasons, if you consider the behind the stage and the surge in different areas, there are several reasons for Russia's surge of activities through Africa. First, the closure of Western sources of trade, investment and financing have forced it to look to Africa. A second, Moscow was also aware that China, India and the United States of America and the European Union had all established strong and competitive presence on the continent of Africa, and that it was in danger of being marginalized there in the region. Third, Russia return to Africa is tied to its deep-rooted belief that it is a great global power, which by definition must be present across the world. There are psychological and political motives at play here. Looking at our research, demonstrating Russia's influence in Africa shows domestic audiences that Russia under the President Vladimir Putin is truly the great power it claimed to be. Moreover, Moscow must become involved in Africa not only to exploit the riches but also to prevent it from coming under the influence of Western poles in the Russian multipolar world.
Russian instructors are working here and their number will increase. At the same time, we provide training to the representatives of Burkina Faso armed forces and law enforcement officers in Russia.
Russia has been winning hearts and minds in West Africa, notably thanks to propaganda videos like this one circulating on social media, claiming Russia could bring peace to conflict-ridden Sahel. Essentially stepping in and succeeding where the West has failed. As discontent grows against France's former colonial power, as well as US presence on the continent, Lavrov continues to surf on this anti-Western rhetoric.
As for the French instructors, I have reason to believe that they're already working in Ukraine. Regardless of whether they are members of the French armed forces or simply mercenaries, they represent an absolutely legitimate target for our armed forces.
Finally, if I want to look into this particular episode, many Russian foreign policy analysts believe that Washington is in retreat and that Russia is winning in politics in the region. They say that Russia's grand strategy into becoming a supreme balancing force in the Afro-Eurasian by skillful use of diplomatic intervention in the region's territorial conflict. Again, success in the Middle East and the heady elixirs of the great power status drive behavior that aim to prevent or prove the view of Russia's really being a great global power, if not a superpower, in the multipolar also other, and must conduct itself accordingly. If you look at the strategic objectives based on those particular factors and what Russian diplomats and commentators themselves have said over the years, they believe that they can, as they said, we can descend Moscow's goals. We must remember that while trade, investment and business opportunities may have intrinsic value, in his March visit to Africa, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov clearly stated and underlining strategic impetus of Russian policy. The positions Mr. Lavrov exposed, looking at that, resembles those Moscow has used to win friendship and influence in Latin America. Those include investment and energy projects, including nuclear energy, arms, deals, and also appeals to regions, self-importance, and also offers to cooperation on United Nations reforms. All of these is aimed at weakening their country's ties with the West. There is a broader and deeper message that Moscow wishes to impact to the Africans and also in external audiences. On this March trip to Africa, the same Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, signaled Russia's desire to play a role like what is now seeking and to a larger degree acquiring in the Middle East, namely power brokers, to be consulted on all major regional issues. Mr. Lavrov commented that Moscow places greatly importance on boosting ties with African region and also sub-regional organizations, primarily the African Union. This also mirrors Moscow's approach in Latin America and, as in the Middle East.
When the United Nations voted recently on whether to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the vote was pretty overwhelming. But some countries abstained, especially in Africa. True, Nigeria and Kenya voted against Russia, but altogether 18 other African countries refused to condemn Russia, including South Africa. Why? I turned to Beverly Ochieng of BBC Monitoring's Africa service in Nairobi.
Russia has been making inroads in the region, whether it's through defense or diplomacy or media, and there was this fear, perhaps by diplomats, of compromising that growing relationship.
But there's also the issue of gold, isn't there? Gold that Russia is hoovering up in various countries in Africa and taking it back, which protects it against the sanctions that the Western countries are imposing.
A lot of commentary does look at the fact that Russia's relationship with various countries, whether it's Sudan, where it is establishing a naval base and also in part of the gold mining industry, or the CAR, where it has established mercenary presence in some of the gemstone mining sites, or even speculation in Mali that Russia could be getting concessions from some of the gold wealth, that Russia's relationship with African countries is extractive and exploitative. But there is some growing support in many urban areas. We've seen pro-Russia protests, specifically at the time when the conflict broke out in Ukraine. Part of it could be because of this perception that Russia is not just the antithesis of the West, but it's bringing a sort of, it's liberating African countries from Western support or from Western sort of dependency, giving defense agreements. It is giving arms to African countries. The biggest purchaser of arms from Russia is Africa. And much of this is coming without the peg of, concerns about human rights. It's very affordable, it's very available, and the arrangements that come with it are ultimately very questionable, but it suits some of the people who are in power. For instance, in Sudan, where you have the Deputy General who has been a proponent of Russia or Russian presence in the mining industry as well as in defense.
Mr. Lavrov's trip was a means to the end, showing the world that Russia is willing and able to offer material benefits to African states that align themselves with Moscow. In fact, the message is more than clear. Moscow is back and a great global power. 2. Russia is giving notice that it intends to challenge Western positions in Africa to the best of its own ability. The promises of investment, energy projects, arms sales, nuclear reactors, and support for reforms at the United Nations come along the request to be recognized formally in regional security organizations, even though Russia is not an African power. In other words, it is part of an overall global policy to challenge the West, regardless of whether Moscow claws back any lost grounds in Africa. That challenge will continue, as we all see before our own eyes. Because we are only at the early stages of Russia's effort to influence the continent, we cannot tell what the consequences might be for Russia, Africa, or the world. But as the ancient proverbs that something new always comes out of Africa suggest, we may well be surprised by the consequences of Russia's intervention in the continent of Africa.
Joe Siracusa, he is an author and professor of security and diplomacy at Curtin University and joins me now live from Melbourne. Professor, what is Lavrov likely to achieve on this trip?
Well, a great deal, Rachel, and good afternoon. Look, he's playing the Africa card. The Arab League will receive him for a talk. It's 22 countries. He renews ties with Egypt. Remember now that Egypt was and the Soviet Union were in each other's hip pockets for a long, long time during the Cold War. So he's got contacts there. And keep in mind also that Africa has parts of Africa he's going to have 30% of the world's mineral ore reserves. I mean, it's a very rich place. It's untapped, and he knows exactly what he's doing. You said in your package there that Russia is fairly much isolated. Well, actually, these kinds of trips make Russia less isolated. They are going about business as usual. President Putin was in Iran. This guy's in Africa. He'll be speaking to, I think, Nigeria and Ethiopia, very large countries. And then he's also going to work with the Democratic Congo. So, you know, he's moving around. He's going about business. You know, this is important for him. And of course, Russia's big rival in Africa is not the United States, which has always dropped the ball there, but China, which has got very large investments all over the place. So Lavrov and the Russians are looking towards the future. I think it's a pretty good move. The American response to this right now has been pretty weak. The Defense Department said, you know, we don't care who he meets. We only care about what he says, which, of course, is nonsense. It's another way of saying that we can't do a thing about it.
We want to thank you for watching. If you are new to this channel, we encourage you to check some of our informative videos. And if you're from one of these regions that Russia is entering into your country and also driving its interests in terms of geopolitical aspect in the region of Africa, let us know in the comment section what your perception are. We want to thank you for watching. We're looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.